Hello there, this is Yannis from the Arcweave team with another episode on the Arcweave plugin for Godot Game Engine. In this episode, we'll go through our Godot example scenes and scripts and get an idea of how all the parts work. First of all, this is our main scene. This is where everything is put together. It has its own script, and let's have a look at its nodes. It has the light and the world environment. The map node 3D parents the ground and the temple. Then we have another node 3D called characters, which parents all our characters, the player and our two NPCs. Then we have our UI. So the character info is the name and the health bar, which get displayed whenever we approach a character. The dialog UI is the avatar, the dialog panel, and the options container. The settings is our settings menu. This is a notification that pops up whenever the project gets up to date. And our inventory items. Finally, of course, our tree includes our Arcweave node, and this already has the Arcweave asset, story T-res. Our characters are two types of nodes. Our player has its own scene. It is a character body 3D with its collision shape. It has its camera, and it also has an area 3D which detects whenever we approach other characters. Then there is a node here called dummy, which is a separate scene on its own, and it's actually shared with the NPCs as well. So the NPC scene is much simpler, and it includes the dummy node. So let's have a look at that scene. So the dummy is basically the mannequin used, the 3D model we got from Mixamo, and its animation player with the animations we use, the get up, idle, run, and walk. Finally, the cloud is just a silly addition to demonstrate how we can switch from clear to rainy weather from our Arcweave project. We'll see that later. These are the most important scenes. We have some other minor scenes, but you can easily explore them by yourselves. Now let's have a look at our scripts. So the player scene has its own script called player GD. We also have the NPC script, much simpler, and our main script, which is the whole game. So if we start from the player, we see that it's very, very close to the default script we get when we create a character body 3D. And the differences are very, very few. One of them is a couple of signals that the node emits. So when we approach an NPC, we emit the NPC approached signal, and it also passes the NPC, the encountered NPC, as an argument. In reverse, when we leave, when we go away from an NPC, again, this signal is emitted. I don't think I'm using this argument, but it doesn't matter. Then we have an export variable called object ID. Let's have a look at this. If we go to our player, we can see that its object ID is Drake. The same export var is used in the NPCs, so Wanda and the healer have their own object IDs that we've manually filled in, and this is to connect the Godot characters with their respective character components. So if we go to our character components in Arcweave, we see that again we have an object ID character attribute, and we see the same values here. So our player is Drake, Wanda has an object ID of the value Wanda, and the healer is called Healer. And this is how we connect the characters with the components. We compare the object ID in Godot with the object ID in the attribute of every component. Other than that, the player script is pretty straightforward. There is an input event for rotating the camera, and then it's the physics process. This function here is to start and stop the rain cloud. Regarding the NPC, we have this object ID. Then we have another export variable called isHealthy, and this is basically a cheap way of making sure that Wanda's character stays lying down when the game begins and doesn't rotate, doesn't revolve to face the player when the player approaches and starts the dialogue. So Wanda has she's not healthy, so this is not ticked, while the healer actually is healthy. The next thing that we need to mention is this Arcweave name and the Arcweave color. So AW is for Arcweave. The Arcweave name is the name that we fetch from the respective component. So once we connect the component with the character using the object ID, we can then fetch the full name of the character, so Wanda Landor, for example, and the Arcweave color, so that is the color value that each character has. And this is pretty much it with the player and the NPC scripts. Now let's go to our main script, which controls the whole game. We won't go through the whole script line by line. We'll just mention a few things that can help you when you want to study the script and write your own game. So first of all, we have a couple of enumerations. These are the game items, the items that are available to take or drop in the game. So we've already seen the potion. The scroll is actually an extra item that you can add, when we'll see that in the next episode when we make story changes. Then we have the weather enumeration, which stands for rain or clear, and it corresponds to the environment component, and specifically the weather attribute, which takes the values clear or rain. I have not actually implemented time, day or night, only the clear or rain. The save path is where the API and the hash gets saved locally on your drive. And then we have an export variable called starting board name. Now so the logic of this is that we have a starting board in our Arcweave project, which not only hosts the starting element, so where play mode begins, but it also has the starting element for each dialogue. So in the game, when we approach an NPC, the game then looks through the Arcweave data to find, specifically in this board, to find the element where this NPC is attached as a component. Now, if we approach Wanda, we obviously want to find the Wanda element, and then this element is actually not rendered, but it points to the beginning of the actual dialogue, to the dialogue board of Wanda. So the starting board does not contain the whole dialogue, but only the starting elements, so it's easy to iterate and find the one that we need. I think we can now go straight to our ready function. So the first thing that happens when the game loads is we load the API and the hash. This actually should be called display API and hash, because I'm gonna actually name it display API and hash. Okay. I think that's more clear because this function only displays on the settings, the API and the hash. So first of all, it checks to see whether we have a saved file for that. And if we don't, we use the Arcweave node's settings and we display those. If we do find a saved file, we display from that file. Just bear in mind, this does not assign values to Arcweave asset and it does not actually fetch. So back to our ready function. Then the prepare game actually prepares all the characters, their animations and the weather, and also stores the starting board in this variable. So every time we start a dialogue, we need to reference that. The prep all characters, what it does is it goes through all the characters and reaches for their component by the object ID, as we've already demonstrated, and then fetches for their color and then paints the character the assigned color. Finally, it also gets the Arcweave name. It assigns the value to the Arcweave name, and we need this because every time we approach a character, this is the name that we see on the screen. So back to our prep game, the character animations, the weather, make sure that it's rainy or cloudy, rainy or clear. Now, this is when the fetching happens, fetch data via display API. So the fetching uses the displayed information, and I've put it here in the ready function because every time we start the game, we fetch the fresh data from our project, but you may not want that, so you can just comment that out. So every time the game starts, we actually get whatever data we've already loaded on our Arcweave node, but if we want to refresh, we explicitly need to click on our fetch button and turn on settings. Now let's move a little further down. Here is our unhandled input function. Every time we approach an NPC, there is an action called talk, which has the space, the enter, and the left mouse button. And once this is triggered, we evaluate the dialogue input, and this is where the dialogue begins or continues or ends. Then we have another input, which is basically the escape key, and we turn on and off the settings menu. Now these two functions, it's quite handy to know when a problem lies on the actual Arcweave side of things. So I've created a push Arcweave error function and a push Arcweave warning, which actually push errors and warnings, but they also attach the phrase Arcweave project error and then the error text. This makes it easy to distinguish whether something must be taken care of in the Arcweave project rather than in the Godot environment. And here we are, the dialogue related functions. After our unhandled input function calls the evaluate dialogue input. This function checks the state of the dialogue and what needs to be done in the next turn. So for example, if we are not currently in dialogue state, we actually need to call dialogue start to begin the dialogue. The rest of this function we'll see in a minute. Dialogue start takes all the steps necessary for the beginning of the dialogue, so it sets the dialogue state to true. It makes sure that the camera stops pivoting, and we can see the cursor now, and we can choose the options. and turn on the dialog UI, all these things. Then we get the current NPC's starting element, and we actually set that as our current element. So set NPC starting element finds it and then sets it as current element. Then we can call get current element from our story and render the current options. So we're talking about this element here, which, as we said before, is not supposed to be rendered. We only want to follow its connection, and it should only have one connection pointing to the beginning of the dialogue. So when we render options, let's see what this does. This function, first of all, it clears any previous buttons that we may have from the previous dialogue turn. Well, obviously not in the very first, in the starting element. And then it calls the story class's generate current options method to get whatever valid options we have, as we saw in the play mode example. Now let's take a break here and have a look at how we handle dialogue in the actual Arcweave project. So in order to make this project playable in the play mode as well, we needed a starting element that can point to the dialogues separately. So if we go to Wanda dialogue, we start here, and once the dialogue finishes, again, in the play mode of Arcweave, we go back to play mode start. Now, the problem here is Godot does not know that it shouldn't be rendering the play mode start element. This is a helper element that we only need to play our project in the play mode here in Arcweave. So how can Godot tell that the dialogue should end before returning to the play mode start element? So we've done this by adding an element attribute in the final elements of each dialogue. So for example, the dialogue with Wanda ends in several ways with several final elements. We have to make sure that all of these elements have the tag dialogue end. So we've created a string field. We gave it the name of tag and the value dialogue end. So every time Godot comes across an element that is tagged as dialogue end, it knows that this is the last element of that dialogue and stops. So this is what happens here if there are no paths, there are no options, or if we have encountered a dialogue end tag, then we must stop the dialogue, and the way we do this is by assigning the true value to is dialogue end. This is actually for the next call of the function evaluate dialogue input. We'll see it in a second. Then, after we make sure that there is a path to follow, we get the option paths, and if there is only one path, we have to save it in our dialogue unique option. This is a variable we declared in the beginning of our script, and this again is used in the next call of evaluate dialogue input. And the final situation is if we have several paths, then we create an option button for each one. But let's go and see how the evaluate dialogue input actually uses the dialogue unique option and is dialogue end. So going back to evaluate dialogue input, this is called from the unhandled input when we press enter space. So let's go through that again now that we know the whole picture. So evaluate dialogue input. If we're not in the dialogue state, then we begin the dialogue. If the dialogue is marked for ending, that is, if we have found an element that has no output options, or it has the dialogue end tag, then we call dialogue end. And, there's the other one. If the dialogue unique option is not null, so if our element only has one unique option, then we select unique path. We follow that option. And then we continue our dialogue. Notice there is no return after that because select unique path actually calls the select path method of the story class, which sets the current element as the target element, but does not actually render. So we do need to call the dialogue continue. So dialogue ends make sure that wraps up the dialogue. It gets rid of the cursor. It turns the dialogue state to false, and gets also rid of the UI, etc., etc. While the dialogue continue is the one that proceeds to the next element. If current NPC is healthy, so we don't want Wanda while she's lying down to be able to pivot and face the player. So if the NPC is healthy, they face the player, and we render the current content. We also get the current element using the story class, and we can show the speaker avatar. The speaker avatar we actually get from the current element's attached component. So every element has the speaker component attached, and this is how we get it. Then again, we render the options. We update the health bar in case there is Arc script that changes the health bar, and we handle variable changes. So we'll go through these in the next episode when we do some story changes. Let's only have a look at handle variable changes. Now this calls another method of the story class called get variable changes, and what this does is it returns any variable changes that have happened in the current element or on the way to the current element. So we remember we have possibly Arc script in labels as well. So if there are no changed variables, then yes, we return. But if there are, then there are a couple of things we check in the specific game. So if the variable that has changed begins with have, and this actually is the have potion variable, but we can add more later, then we run the inventory IO function, which adds or removes items from the inventory. So if the variable has changed from false to true, we obviously add the item using the inventory IO function. And the reverse, if it changed to false, then we obviously get rid of it. The other thing we check here is Wanda's health. Yep, it's cheap, but it does the job. If you have more characters that you want to check their health, then you can just use it like this prefix here. You need to check the suffix health, and then it's the name of the character in the beginning. Well, this is a very ad hoc solution. That's why I'm calling it cheap. It checks whether we get an increase in Wanda's health. That is when she drinks the potion, obviously. Then we make her healthy again, so we turn is healthy to true. We play the animation that she gets up, and then we cue the animation idle. Once the get up is finished, then she goes to idle mode. A couple of words about the inventory IO. This basically loads the icon that gets displayed in the inventory UI on our screen, and it uses the inventory item TSCN and it instantiates one of those, and then it loads the icon, whatever the icon that has the name plus the PNG. So if we go to our assets, item icons, we can see that we have our potion here, which is the one that the game uses already, but it also has an extra item called scroll PNG, and we can, in the next episode, we'll see how to add this in the game as well. I think we're done more or less with the main script. There are a few little things here and there, like painting the characters and showing their labels, their health bar updates, but all these are quite clear, I hope. So that was it for this episode, I guess. If something is not clear and you have questions, I'll be happy to answer on the Arcweave Discord server. In the next and final episode, we'll see how we can perform story changes as well as quickly test different story versions using our exported game. If you find these tutorials helpful, please subscribe to Arcweave's official YouTube channel. You can find us, the Arcweave team, hanging out on our Discord server, and of course you can follow Arcweave on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Yannis from Arcweave, thank you for watching, and let the games begin.